Next week, we're celebrating the 83rd birthday of Wendy Carlos. If you're wondering now, who is Wendy Carlos? Was she in ABBA? No, but we'll get back to ABBA, to Benny and his synthesizers, which is one of ABBA's secret weapons, sometimes even overlooked. And Wendy Carlos will bring us there. Hey, so, Wendy Carlos is a pioneer of electronic synth music. She did the soundtrack to Walt Disney's science fiction film Tron from 1982, one of the first films to use extensive computer-generated images. She also wrote and recorded music for Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. But most importantly, she revolutionized the use of synthesizers in popular music with an album called Switched on Bach, which brings us back in time to the late 60s. This first album of hers was released in 1968 and it contains music by Johann Sebastian Bach, but performed on a Moog synthesizer by Wendy Carlos. So the album mixes classical music with electronic sounds. What a fascinating match! It was successful and an enormous influence for musicians to use the Moog synthesizer, especially in popular music. In the following year, George Harrison was one of the first rock musicians to record and produce an electronic music album using the Moog synthesizer. He then introduced his other bandmates from the Beatles to the Moog, and in the same year they used it prominently on their final recorded album, Abbey Road. That album would be very different without those layers of synthesizers. Now when it comes to ABBA and Benny Andersson, I don't know if he ever mentioned Wendy Carlos anywhere. If someone knows anything, please let us know in the comments below. But, of course, I would be very surprised if he wasn't aware of Wendy Carlos and especially Switched on Bach. We know that Benny is a great fan of classical music, especially the music of Bach, and he's a great fan of synthesizers. So Switched on Bach should have been a perfect album for him. In fact, in the early 70s, Benny would be playing on a very similar album in concept. We'll talk about that in a moment. What we certainly know is that he was inspired to buy his first mini Moog after hearing a song called Popcorn from 1972, a synth pop instrumental recorded by the American instrumental band Hot Butter, which became a hit in Europe. That song was originally released in 1969 by Gershon Kingsley, who was another pioneer of electronic music and the Moog synthesizer. It obviously came just 1 year after Switched on Bach, so it might have been another one of those songs inspired by Wendy Carlos. Benny bought his first synthesizers during a trip to London in 1973, the Mellotron M400 and a Mini Moog. In the same year, Wendy Carlos released Switched on Bach 2. Take a look at this artwork. Because, also in 1973, we are now getting to that very special album I mentioned. Benny played Moog on a Swedish album which has an interesting parallel to the concept of Switched on Bach. It mixes modern synthesizers with classical music, but this time in the shape of 12 Swedish folk songs played on Moog. He would also develop this concept later on his 2 solo albums, mixing folk music with synth sounds, especially on the gorgeous album November 1989. Going back to 1973, I don't know when exactly Switched on Bach 2 came out, but the album of Nesta Kalle and his Moogmen was released in November or December that year, so most likely it came after Wendy Carlos' album, and Benny and his gang were perhaps inspired by it, even with the artwork. But what about ABBA and their use of synthesizers? Benny was certainly falling in love with a Mini Moog as soon as he bought it, and from Waterloo on, it was used in all of ABBA's albums and their recordings in 1982, and perhaps it also returned for Voyage. In the studio, Benny did many overdubs with the Mini Moog. He would use it to fill in riffs or snippets, and also to emulate other instruments on the song by playing the same part again on the synthesizer to amplify that specific instrument. Listen to this fascinating example of Dancing Queen.
Känner du igen den här låten? Har hört den förut?
Sometimes Benny filled 16 tracks from 24 available tracks on the tape with layers of synthesizers. Of course, he would use many other synthesizers with the development of ABBA's music, including a Polymoog, which you can hear on the Arrival album, and which is beautifully layered on ABBA the album, especially on Eagle. It was also used on the first sessions for Voulez-Vous. And finally, I think the crown jewel of his love and use for synthesizers really came in 1979, when Benny got a Yamaha GX1, which was even brought along on tour alongside his beloved Mini Moog. As I mentioned, from all of his synthesizers, the Mini Moog was the one which was most frequently used in ABBA's music. Remember that the Moog synthesizer colored switched on Bach, and Wendy Carlos introduced an entire generation of musicians to the world of electronic sounds. Now, to be fair, Wendy Carlos did not really appreciate smaller synthesizer systems like the Mini Moog. She called it a cash-in toy. But as we see, Benny, on the other hand, was extremely positive about it. He described it as the best synthesizer with a very own sound, soft and musical, and that quote was even from the late 70s. So we have these contrasting views of two musical masters, and I think this shows exactly why ABBA's use of synthesizers throughout their music is so special. They were secret pioneers of how to use synthesizers without making it too obvious. Benny's synthesizers are impeccably interwoven with the remaining tapestry of instruments and layers of vocals, especially with the evolution of ABBA's music and production. They always loved that mixture of acoustic and electronic sounds. The way they are mixed within the sound bed is such a natural ingredient of the overall package. They are shimmering over ABBA's songs like a sparkle, and that sparkle started in 1968 with his mesmerizing, revolutionary album by Wendy Carlos. And by the way, there are two other curious connections between ABBA and Carlos. The style of Tron, which she wrote the music for, was a confirmed influence for some of the costumes of ABBA's new show Voyage. And the Voyage album has an artwork which shows a solar eclipse. Wendy Carlos is a passionate photographer for solar eclipses. She developed special techniques for it, and her work has been published by NASA. As I said, pure coincidences, but lovely how it somehow comes together in a way. It does bring us back to the present day, to ABBA's big return, which we are celebrating this month, and to one of my favorite artists who is celebrating her birthday on Monday. So happy birthday to Wendy Carlos, wherever you are. Alright, until then, hey do!